If someone asked you to identify the characteristics of an amazing speech, what would you choose? Body language? Eye contact? Appropriate hand gestures? My guest today says, not even close on all three. He tells us what it is and how you can implement it today. Next. Hello and welcome to 1% Better. I'm your host, Joe Ferraro. Thank you so much for listening, for sharing, for subscribing, for being a part of the journey of the mindset, language, and behavior, improving all three each and every day. You can follow along at 1%betterproject.com and also on Twitter and the new toy Instagram. I know, a little bit of a late adapter, but if you haven't had a chance to check out what's going on at Ferraro on Air on Instagram, we've experimented with some video. I know. We've experimented with some new content, and I would love to have you take a peek over there, trying to bring you some new things to think about, some new ways to challenge your mindset, language, and behavior. It's been an unbelievable journey. Episode 50 is here, and I went out and got a whale. Someone you've never heard of, no doubt. Found today's guest from the Read to Lead podcast with Jeff Brown. Saw Tim Pollard and his name, a book called The Compelling Communicator. Went out, recruited Tim. He said yes, and it wasn't just because of his amazing accent. He takes everything you've learned in Public Speaking 101 and he flips it on its head. Body language, nah. Eye contact, overrated. Well, what is it that makes a compelling message? Tim tells you all that and then some in our conversation today on episode 50. If you've been on the journey, you know I've gone out week after week to try to bring you the best in the field to help you get 1% better. Today, Tim does it with research and practicality, experience and philosophy. What a conversation with Tim Pollard. Today on the show, it's a communicator, it's a speaker, it's a teacher. Tim, by way of Billings, Montana. Thank you so much for joining 1% Better, Tim.
Joe, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I loved your book, The Compelling Communicator, Mastering the Art and Science of Exceptional Presentation Design. Man, thanks for writing this.
Thank you. A bit of a labor of love, I'm sure, as all books are, but it was fun to write and to get it all down, and we're delighted at how well it's received. It's been lovely.
I try to stand in multiple worlds. I'm a teacher in the classroom, teaching 12th grade, public speaking, creative writing. I'm on the podcast. I'm listening to great communicators all the time. And yet your book managed to bring a new insight and actually a whole new way of thinking. Here on the show, we talk about the mindset, language, and behavior of daily improvement. And your book cuts across all three of those, or I should say threads the needle between them all. I think it's important to start with the mindset that you guys approach this book with. And, you know, I actually want to do something a little unusual and read a passage to you. And this might be a great way to frame our conversation, if that'd be okay.
Sure, yeah. I want to see what you picked.
Yeah, it comes from page 57, and it says that most of the people I meet say they want to be great communicators, but they don't think they can be because they don't think they have the natural talent. Now, first of all, that's a beautiful place to kind of unpack with natural talent. But you go on to say, whether it's from surveys, experience, or by example, we can prove that when it comes to great communication, it's content that captivates. Man, that's a mouthful. That is a mouthful. What do you got?
Well, it is interesting. So if you actually deconstruct that little line of argument, it's very true. I have conversations on the plane all the time with people who'd love to be great communicators. And when they say, I can't be, it's because they have this peculiar belief, although I do understand where it comes from, but it's all about kind of stage presence, you know, that I'm up there, I have no nerves, I'm stunningly well dressed, I'm witty and warm and endearing, and I've got the eye contact of a peregrine falcon and the body language of, Sir Laurence Olivier, and they don't have that. Most people don't have it. But what we've proven just time and time again is that is not what makes for a great communicator. You actually think about it, you never leave a bad presentation and go, I hated that guy. He had his hands in his pockets. Can you believe it? He didn't make good eye contact. You never say that. You always come away going, I just was so confused. Man, he just fire hosed me with too many slides, all those bullets. If you think about it, it's obvious that we judge either favorably or unfavorably. We judge all communication by the way the content has been architected. So it's kind of an interesting paradox. We all know that. Every time you leave a bad lecture or a good one or a bad or a good presentation, you're always judging it based on the way the content was organized. And yet, when you want to go and communicate, you suddenly start thinking you've got to have great eye contact. It's a curious paradox. And one of the ways I talk about it in the book is I contrast some people who are breathtakingly good at the physicality of delivery, but who are in fact surprisingly ineffective in as far as a transfer of learning goes. And I also talk about some speakers who are thoroughly unimpressive from the standpoint of delivery skills, and yet who are observably brilliant communicators. The end point of all this, the big idea of all this, is it's incredibly good news. It's incredibly liberating because it means that extraordinary communications effectiveness is actually within the reach of anybody, because you're not actually bound by any sort of genetic, limitations of not having all those great attributes of stage presence. And in fact, I believe that as long as you're above average IQ or even solidly average, you can acquire the skills of architecting exceptional content and become an extraordinary communicator. We've seen so many people, TED speakers we coach, for example, who you would never look at and observe and say that's an extraordinary speaker, and yet they've been incredibly effective because we've helped them to understand the thing they really need to get right. So it's interesting you should start there, because you start really at the very central premise of the book, which is very interesting.
Well, that's why we get paid the big bucks around here, Tim. When I read a book like yours, I can't help but notice a lot of things. And what you've done in the book, to my mind, is you followed the exact same pattern that you teach. You tell stories and you lace it with lessons. So the book becomes something incredibly easy to follow. I will also say that it's the only book on communication I've ever read where you save the essentials of delivery for the epilogue. And further, you don't list eye contact until number 4 of 5 essentials. So you're doubling down on this theory, and it's more than a theory. You bring the science.
Yeah, when we teach our full experiential learning 2-day training, the second day, it was kind of a long half day, is when we do talk about delivery, because there are aspects of delivery that you still do want to get right. We can chat about that if you want. And I think we give about 45 seconds of 2 days to eye contact. It's like basically the rule is don't do anything weird. Don't stare at people in a creepy way. That's kind of it. I mean, there are some things to avoid, but they're just not the central thing. And the problem is when you get focused on those things, which tends to happen. You've ever taken a presentation skills class, you've been videoed, it just gets obsessively into this idea of were you fidgeting, were you twiddling a pencil, did you have your hands in your pockets? The problem is when you get so obsessively focused on that, you completely miss what matters. And so I have actually made an argument that I don't think it would be really polite for me to say that traditional presentation skills thinking is helpful but a bit superficial. I don't want to be arrogant or rude, but I actually don't think that. I think it's actually unhelpful because by focusing on the minor, you miss the major, and it distracts you from what really matters. We ask this at every workshop. I've known hundreds of people who've taken that training, done everything they were told, and seen no improvement whatsoever in their communications effectiveness, and are deeply frustrated by the experience. And I could have told them to save their money, because if I slide bomb you with 100 slides of thoroughly disorganized content, which is too much about me and not enough about you and your problem, I can have the freaking sparkling eye contact, all the sparkling eye contact in the world. I can't redeem those design deficiencies. So we're on a mission to help people understand what really matters.
Yeah, mission backed up by science. You could find all about it at oratium.com, oratium.com. That's where Tim can be found, and your company does great work. There's a piece of software in there I want to speak about later, but I want to backtrack to the title of the book, The Compelling Communicator. When I dove into that, I had already listened to a few interviews in preparation for the book, but it was interesting to me because before the book, I would have thought compelling means exactly that, the beautiful delivery, the elegant word choice, the sparkling body language. And it's just, again, not what you unpack in the book. And I wonder, about that word choice, and kind of also, how do you know that what you teach is true?
Great. So two different questions there. It's funny you saw that. I think compelling in all words are interpreted differently, which is an interesting communications lesson by people who hear them, because we always interpret everything through our own lens. So you could say, oh, that person's really compelling, and that could be an observation on their eye contact and delivery and stuff. But the point I make, and I think this is very important, is compelling has a very literal meaning, which is from the word compel, which means it drives people to action. And that's what communication's about. Salespeople do not make sales pitches with no concern for the outcome. They're trying to create an outcome. When you go and pitch your company to an investor, when you go and pitch a tough project to a team that you need to rally behind you for a few months, you are always, hopefully explicitly, but certainly implicitly, looking for an action. A compelling communicator is a communicator that understands that all communication is ultimately about securing action, whether it's a multi-million-dollar sale or getting a kid to stop texting while they drive. And what we are providing is a model that creates that allows somebody to become compelling and create the action they want in their audience. And the second question you ask is how do we know it works? It is, I could literally bore you. You'd beg me to stop if I just relayed all the stories. So within the book, as you'll have noticed, we have a very powerful tool called the Pyramid of Planned Outcome. What it does, it asks you to define what is the action you want your audience to take. And you work back from the action to design what would be the big ideas you would need to drive that action. And then you work back further to say, okay, well, what evidence would I need to prove my big ideas are true? And it's a really cool tool that establishes the core architecture of any message. Now, normally a sales organization would start with that, and then they work through and they turn that into a fairly polished script and a rather elegant piece of sales collateral and all the kind of fanciness that goes along with that. I could show it to you. I wish I could. An email I got yesterday, I won't say who it is. We have a major client, very well-known industrial company. And there was a sales guy there. We've trained him, and he sketched a pyramid, and that's all he took with him. I mean, I swear to you, it must have been, if not a cocktail napkin, only a piece of paper. He sketched this pyramid, and I'm like, dude, you really need to do a bit more than that. But he had got the intellectual argument down through that, and has a meeting with a customer who has not been especially receptive in the past, apparently. And I just got this email that 30 days later, they get a $1.8 million deal. I'm like, well, that's not how I would have recommended you do it. But that is just time and time and time again what we see, that when you design communication that aligns with the way people's brains work and the way they make decisions, you'll be more effective. But then if you flip the coin, and you may remember this anecdote, there was a guy at one of our classes, and it's a great story, actually. Again, I couldn't say who the company was, but very well-known company. And he took our class, and a few weeks later, or days, I think his boss, great woman, she'd taken the class earlier, was chatting to him in her office and said, how was this class? How'd you enjoy it? She'd enjoyed it, so she wanted to ask, and he kind of broke down. And I heard that. I was a bit nervous. I'm like, that's not normally the outcome you want from your training, that guys start crying when you ask them about it. But he said, and the email is reproduced in the book, if you remember. He said, it's interesting. I applied what I learned, and that night, right after the class, I had the first meaningful interaction I've had with my teenage daughter in a couple of years. And that was very touching for us, because at one level, we're a very commercial organization. We take people's broken sales messaging and we fix it, and they sell a ton more, or they don't pay us. It's that cool. But the stories that really touch me are the ones like that, where nonprofits or just individuals are just being much more effective in their own lives. So we have this lovely blend, if you like, of empirical data and anecdotal evidence. And that's what gets us up in the morning. The people who work for us, we're all just passionate about getting other people to be more effective. And it's the thing that motivates us. It's always fun when your job is also your passion.
Yeah. A few moments ago, you asked me if I remember that anecdote, and without fawning, I do. I remember quite a bit from the book, and I've known you a little while now, and I know that you did that on purpose.
Yes, I mean, there's a theme in the book you'll remember, that ultimately you build communication around 6 important process steps, and one of them which is just incredibly fascinating, I think, is that the way you make an argument sticky is to plant it equally in the left and right hemisphere of the brain. Now, data and facts, they're really important, but they're processed by the left brain, and there are two things we know about that. That's not very sticky. We tend to forget them. That's why we're not good with phone numbers. And also, that's a very long way from the brain's decision centers, which are in the right brain. So what we teach is when you have a big idea, I can't get into the detail here, obviously, now, but what you want to do is plant it equally in the left and right brain. And one of the ways of doing that, there are five tools you can use to plant it in the right brain. One of them is imagery, but one of them is stories. Stories are processed primarily in the right brain. In fact, a story has an extraordinary ability to light up incredible areas of the brain. So I could say to you factually, this model will make you more effective as a communicator. And that's important. You'll hear that, and it'll go in your left brain. But then I'll tell you the story about this guy and his meaningful interaction with his daughter. And that story gets stored in your left or your right brain. And what happens actually is your brain forms a neural pathway between them. It's easiest to understand by thinking about songs. Melodies are stored in the right brain, lyrics are stored in the left brain. You think of a song as one thing, happy birthday to you. But what I just did was coming from two places in the brain, lyric in the left, melody in the right. So what great communicators do is this is the deep end of the pool we're getting into early here, is they understand how to plant an idea in multiple places in the brain. And that's what creates stickiness and memorability, and then this key thing of retellability, which is the ability to recreate that communication later. So, that story was quite intentional. We use stories throughout the book, but they're never randomly chosen, and they're never without a teaching point. They're always in support of a critical idea, which is how stories and visuals should be used.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And actually just a really tangible way for listeners to understand that is how drastically people go wrong with slides. I mean, the amount of text and fonts on slides. I mean, I guess that's just a simple way to understand the image goes into the right brain, and you just don't need that much text.
Yeah, well, we could get into a really deep discussion here. I mean, once you start putting words up on screen, you don't have visual aids. You've just given them a different place to read what should probably be in a document. So the first mistake people make is they think that by projecting something, they've created visual aids. They haven't. The rules of using visual aids are not well understood. I personally would never use PowerPoint or Keynote or Prezi. It can be used effectively, but the temptation to the dark side, Luke, is pretty damn bad because you're always going to start adding bullets and adding slides. The other problem with PowerPoint, which no one has ever really thought about, is the big problem with a PowerPoint deck, even if you get it right, is this. People will not represent someone else's slide deck. So this idea of retellability hits a rock, it hits a wall, if you like, or an iceberg, perhaps better, when you get to the point of retellability. That's a slightly different point. The main problem with the way people are using slides is they're either not using visuals at all. In other words, just blocks of text and bullet points, which they just read. So it's an hour of slide narration, illustrated by the presenter's bald patch, which is just hell on earth, as we've all known. Or what I see a lot of now is they know that's bad, so they throw these random stock images onto these bulleted slides without changing the bullets in an attempt to try and enliven them. So what you now have is a crappy bulleted slide with the same 5 bullets and a picture of a happy, smiling, ethnically diverse group of people around a conference table. And we've all seen that slide in every presentation.
Yeah, their hands in the middle saying team.
Yeah, or pretty young girl in headset for any discussion of customer service or call centers. It's so wrong. It's so off base because these slides, these visuals aren't teaching anything. They're simply an attempt by the slide maker to disguise the fact they've built you a crappy PowerPoint. But what they've built is a crappy bulleted PowerPoint with a randomly chosen picture, actually making things worse because the picture is distracting and confusing. We could get into this a lot, but this particular skill of how to use visuals is the easiest thing in the world. The easiest thing in the world is to learn how to use visuals properly. There are 5 rules and a 10-year-old could obey them, but nobody knows what they are. And once you know what they are and you can start using visuals properly and integrating them properly, combining them with your narrative and with a document that you leave your audience, that's when the magic really starts to happen.
Yeah, and you do document those in the book, and that sound you heard a little while ago was people fainting when they heard you say you would never use PowerPoint, you would never use Prezi or Keynote. I know the answer from the book, but what do you tell people to use?
Well, I probably should modify what I'm saying. I would never, ever in a million years use it in the way that it's being used. At absolutely pressed, I would use it, but I would use it to do the right thing, which is to present a very small number of teaching visuals that support big ideas. Personally, I use a software tool called the Brain. It's also called Personal Brain. It's actually mind mapping software, but it has a nice functionality within it whereby you can pull graphics up and make them go away just with a swirl of a mouse. And the reason I like it is organic and not linear, because when I'm presenting, I don't like being held to the linear structure of PowerPoint. You've ever been in a meeting and somebody says, well, can you go back to that? And the guy starts clicking back, and not only has he got to go through 15 slides, but he had reveals on all those slides, so he's got to click the button 60 times. Now, there are shortcuts, but people don't know them. When you're communicating in almost all settings, it can and should be a conversation. A conversation has a certain degree of being organic more than linear to some extent. And so I don't like slideware that holds you to a truly linear structure. But again, I think that's a more secondary point. It's not about the software tool. The tool is just the vehicle in which you put the visuals you've chosen to create. I don't, at a fundamental level, have a problem with PowerPoint. It's a way to display things on a screen. That's the 2% problem. The 98% of the problem is people don't understand what they're even trying to do when they put visuals up on the screen, what they're trying to accomplish. You know, visual should be a single image, not a compound image, that supports a critical idea with the purpose of landing that idea in a second place in the brain. It should be up there for as long as you're describing the idea, and then it should go down. And that is not hard, but it's a million miles away from what most people are doing. So again, I don't want to be known as the anti-PowerPoint guy.
Yeah.
I don't love PowerPoint for some of its other features. I don't like the linearity of it. More importantly, I think it creates problems of retellability. I don't want people reading the book to think, I'm going to stop using PowerPoint. I want people reading the book to say, I now understand how to use visuals to create a deeper level of engagement with the audience's brain. So they've maybe heard an idea spoken orally, processed by their auditory cortex. They've looked down, seen that idea captured in the document they've been given, which goes into the senses where you process language and reading, and seen a visual image that was complementary to the two. And now I've planted that idea in 3 places in the brain, and you will remember that for a very long time. And the way people use PowerPoint right now doesn't even come close to that.
The book is 290 pages, but it does not feel that way. It doesn't feel long. It's a dip in, dip out. And of all 290, Tim, there's a line in here that you go back to time and time again. In short, your presentations will hit the standard of powerfully landing a small number of big ideas. And I can't tell you how many times I've repeated that. Powerfully landing a small number of big ideas. And it's an incredible idea. It's a little frightening to me, if I'm being candid, because almost every speaker I know has been taught to overplan. In case I run out of time, I want to have 20 ideas. Is that something you see time and time again?
Oh, you're kidding. Yeah, you're really onto something there. So you've got a couple of interesting ways this could go. Firstly, why do we do this? Every presentation, it borders on the bizarre. I mean, it's you can't make this stuff up. I was at a lunch and learn recently where a guy was kind of introducing the 401k plan to a group of people. They had their sandwich. He had about 10 minutes. He tried to get through 45 slides. I'm like, what madness? How do we get here? You know, it is routine in technical sales organizations to see slide decks of 60, 80, 100, 120 slides. Now, most good salespeople don't try and present them all, although let me tell you, I've seen it done. I mean, it's crazy. Now, these are not evil or stupid people. If you actually ask the question, why do we do this, you get some intriguing answers. I want to look smart. I want to cover all my bases. I have a heterogeneous audience. I've got to cover different things that they care about. I need to prove my points well. I want to show that I'm well prepared. One of the most interesting, and boy, we could talk about this, is the one-shot problem. It's getting harder and harder to get in front of customers. So buckle up, Joe. You're going to get the whole thing because it was so hard to get the meeting. My point being is there are very significant and very important motivations that underpin that. We do want to look smart. We should look smart. We do want to be thorough. We do want to be complete. We do want to make best use of our one shot. We're asking the right questions, but we're coming up with the wrong answer. The answer is just pack as much in as you can, talk as fast as you can, and bang questions. And yet we have a lifetime's experience that it doesn't work, but we still do it. It's paradoxical, but it's absolutely hilarious. Now, how do you solve for that? This is really the core of everything, right? Which is why that one big idea is the big idea of the whole book, which is powerfully land a small number of big ideas. It goes back to how the brain works. The human brain, let me give you a phrase. This phrase is not in the book, funnily enough, and it's one I've started using more and more. Ideas are the currency of the brain. Ideas are the currency of the brain. Your brain and mine operates at the level of ideas. Somebody might be listening to this podcast, and let's imagine it's 40, 45 minutes, and later on somebody says, oh, was that any good? What was it about? You don't press play in your brain and play a recording of 45 minutes. What you actually say was, this guy was kind of interesting. He was saying this, and he was saying this, and he was saying this. In other words, that listener will automatically, unconsciously have taken that 45 minutes of content and reduced it to a small number of ideas, because that's the currency of the brain. And prove this any number of ways. I mean, the best example perhaps is one from history where, remember the O.J. Simpson trial, right? And 7 months of prosecution testimony, and history clearly shows that 7 months of prosecution testimony, is mind-numbing amount of data, was ultimately overcome by one idea of 8 words. And I guarantee you, without me even starting the phrase, 90% of people listening to this are already mouthing it. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. and yeah, I know you were there. Now, what's interesting about that is, when was the trial? 94?
94, yeah.
94, most of it, 94, verdict handed down in early 95. So here we are, 23 years later, roughly. Now, obviously, the idea has been knocking around the popular culture since then, but we have an idea that is so sticky, or perhaps better said, we have evidence here of how sticky ideas are. Here we are, 23 years later, and most people listening to this can recount that idea unprompted, without me starting the phrase, with no prior thought about this court case. None of you were thinking about this before I started telling the story. That demonstrates the power and stickiness and traction of ideas. And so what great communicators do and should do, and they have done this throughout history, is identify what are the critical ideas you need to communicate. And let me put in parenthesis, the critical ideas you need to communicate in order to drive your audience to action. That's incredibly important. But the critical ideas you need to communicate, and build everything around those. Now then, data and fact and analysis, they're all important, but they become servant to the ideas instead of being the main theme. Because 99% of presentations I see are just packed full of fact and data. We're Western rationalists. We think if I just make a really thorough, detailed, rational case, I'll get somebody to a decision. Completely fails to understand how people actually make decisions. You want to focus your communication around a small number of big ideas. Let the right amount of compelling fact and data support those ideas, and then you'll be effective. And so it is quite deliberate, but I'm also delighted that you pulled this out, that particular touchstone is what most resonated with you, because, again, at some level, that very centrally is what the book was about, as far as how to make your communication effective. I mean, the book was about a lot of things, but the main way you make communication effective is to make that your key purpose in your communication design.
Tim, you love this stuff.
Yeah, I do now. When you said it didn't feel like 290 pages to read, it sure as hell felt like 290 pages to write. But no, I do. I've just always been obsessively interested in why does communication work when it works, and why does it not work when it doesn't work? There are hundreds of authors from the Middle Ages. Why does Shakespeare survive? Why does Shakespeare survive when, Marlowe and others, and they're like, yeah, we kind of know a bit about him, but most people listening can recite at least some of stuff that was written in, the 16th century. And by the way, there are reasons why that I can tell you, and it just starts to become incredibly interesting. Why do some speeches from history stand out? Why do some phrases from speeches in history stand out? Yeah. Why is the Gettysburg Address so well remembered? Did you know that there was a guy who spoke after Lincoln for 2.5 hours? His script was 33,000 words. His name was Everett Eldridge or something like that, I want to say, but nobody remembers anything of that. I mean, Lincoln wrote to him and said, hey, that was a great presentation, dude, but the guy already knew he was dead. Why is it that some communication will outlive time and most just dies? That's an interesting question. It's just been something that's fascinated me.
Yeah, and there's so much more in the book, and I have to press you to if you would be so kind to tell the story that in some ways frames the entire book. In a way, the story pits charisma versus your central idea. And I love the story. There's a number of stories I wish we had time to get to. But I think that in terms of landing your big idea, the CEO and Eva is just a great pairing. It's a pairing that people will hear and say, how could that be possible? And that's how that was my reaction.
Yeah, and that was deliberately the opening, because I was setting up a paradox that we then needed to explain. So the story, very briefly, as you know, I was actually speaking at a conference. I'd spoken in the afternoons, big companies leadership conference. It was down at Disney. The company wasn't Disney. And there's about 3,000 people. I'd spoken in the afternoon. And then they said, look, hey, Tim, we know you love communication. Stick around, because the CEO, the guy who's going to do the closing keynote, he's an absolute, master of this, absolutely incredible guy. And so I stuck around. And it was a very interesting story. So, he was meant to speak for 30 minutes. He spoke for precisely 30 minutes. Within a few seconds, he was polished. He was witty, funny. He's got his $10,000 Armani suit on. He's working the crowd. His eye contact was just, he's just completely connected with the room. He's just got the effortless body language, no nerves. Doesn't fumble or stumble a word. He's just crushing it by every traditional thought or description of communication skills. He doesn't slide bomb them, doesn't have 50 slides. He has one slide, which is his topic. But as you will recall, his slide and his topic was very interesting. It was, I remember this just like it was yesterday, the 10 things we've got to get right this year. Now, he moved through them effortlessly. Each one was individually brilliant. It was well analyzed. The solution was well described. It was beautiful. But I did notice there was no intellectual connection between the 10. There was no storyline in a particular facet of the meeting ends, and it's hilarious, Joe. I'm not kidding. People were close to throwing underwear. People are just, they're like standing ovation. They're crying. Like, this guy's a little bit of a cult hero. I can't say who it is. Well-known CEO. And just absolutely, the house just erupts, goes crazy. And then the MC comes up at the end of the day. He's not stupid. He doesn't waste any time, doesn't try and top this. He just comes up, says, thanks for coming. See you next year. So we are literally within a minute of him finishing. And I was sat near the back. And as we left, as the crowd left, I just grabbed this guy, and he was happy to talk to me because he'd heard me speak earlier. And I said to him, wasn't that amazing? A guy's crying. He's putting his underwear back on. I'm like, it's Jonathan. No, it was like that, almost, close to. And I said, wasn't that amazing? He goes, yeah. And it was amazing. And I said, do you mind me asking you a question? He said, no. I said, do you mind telling me, how many of the 10 things do you remember? And he thought for a couple of seconds. I'll never forget this. There's a reason I started the book this way. And he could come up with 2. So here you have a guy. He's the CEO. He has been breathtakingly effective by all traditional standards of communication. And within a minute or 2 minutes of him ending, he has only managed to get 20% of his message to stick. He has an 80% decay rate, which is, by the way, very common for most communication, although most communication takes a couple of days for you to forget 80% of it. This was pretty impressive within 2 minutes. And that sets up an enormous paradox, because by any standard, this guy's a world-class communicator. And yet, from a true transfer of learning standpoint, he's been a complete failure.
Yeah. I actually have two. Can I interject with 2 quick follow-ups there?
Yeah.
One, did you have a hunch that no one was going to remember it, or did you just ask that organically?
Oh, no, I knew. I mean, I didn't even have to guess. I just wanted to see what the number was.
You knew.
Absolutely knew. Yeah.
Okay.
Because of this key principle of brain science, right, which is the human brain stores information contextually. We need context. Have you ever been to a cocktail party? This story's in the book. Have you ever been to a cocktail party and you're introduced to somebody and you just get their name, and then you drift away on the sort of the tides of the cocktail party, and a minute later you've forgotten their name, right?
Sure.
Well, you have an extraordinary memory. So do I. I bet you think of the biggest cities you've ever lived in. You can navigate those from memory. You've got unbelievable memory. As 3-dimensional maps of enormous, difficult cities like London and Mexico City for me. And yet I can't remember this guy's name. Why? Because a human being's brain stores information contextually. Without context, the brain just has no way of storing. You're not being lazy. It just doesn't work that way. And the problem with bullets or ideas that do not come within a narrative which creates context is you're guaranteed forgettability. So I had 100% certainty that this guy wouldn't get more than 3 or 4. I mean, he impressed me by only getting 2. And he'd been listening hard.
Yeah.
And the point I teach from this, there's several interesting points that come from it. One is it absolutely reinforces that design trumps delivery, because it was a design problem that caused him to fail, because he had not created an intellectual flow or a narrative flow. And remember I said earlier, there are 6 things you've got to get right. One of the 6, one of them was planting an idea in the left and right brain. One of them is narrative flow, to create context, to create memorability. That's a very interesting lesson. But the main lesson I teach from it, there's actually also a very funny one. The main lesson I teach from it is that you cannot be an effective communicator if you don't understand the brain. Because this guy was incredibly high IQ. I mean, very, very successful. He didn't bother creating a narrative because he didn't know he needed to.
Yeah, they're throwing money on stage. He's thinking, I'm crushing it. And that was my second.
By the way, on that point, I've got to say this. This is a really interesting point. Do you think his audience rated his session highly?
I do.
Of course, they loved it. And why? I'm going to give you a really interesting nugget here. Because audiences evaluate speakers based on how entertained they feel.
Yeah.
They don't evaluate speakers based on how much they've learned. So this guy has, in fact, totally screwed up, and yet his audience is hurling underwear and money. And trust me, I'm not going to be the guy to go up and tell him. I'm not stupid.
Yeah.
I wanted to go up and say, in an ideal and pure world, like the liar world, I would have gone up and said, that was amazing from one standpoint, but as a communicator, you've been extremely ineffective.
Yeah.
But I wasn't going to do that. But what's interesting is how his experience reinforces getting it wrong. And again, the book exists to tell us that we've been basing our entire communications life on the wrong set of rules.
And I was wondering about that, though, Tim. Is there an argument to be made that his talk was, in effect, successful because of that entertainment value, because of that Maya Angelou quote about how they make you feel? Is there an argument that can exist for that?
Yeah, not one that I'd like to defend. He was up there. Well, he was up there with presumably the goal of rallying an organization behind 10 important strategic initiatives. And 8 of those 10 were lost by most people immediately, and all 10 presumably shortly thereafter. So I'm not sure I'm comfortable with it, about how you make them feel. If I leave a sales call and my customer feels great and doesn't buy anything, I don't think I'm too happy with that. If I tell my son, I try to instruct my son not to text and drive, and he feels really good about the conversation and carries on texting and driving, I'm not sure I'm okay with that. So you get into I don't want to get into an existential discussion, but it really does come down to what is the purpose of communication? Now, do you want your audience to feel good afterwards and to have enjoyed it? Yeah, sure. People love our classes. They absolutely love them. Our classes are entertaining, but the purpose and goal is not entertainment.
Yeah.
You don't have to choose between one and the other. You can be fun, lively, witty, engaging. People love our classes, but they learn a hell of a lot at the same time. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not be interesting or educational. That's not the choice. It's be interesting and educational, or be interesting and uneducational. This guy was fun and interesting, but his audience didn't learn anything. What we teach people is, in fact, how to be both.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Oradium.com is where you could find it for sure. And then you contrast this with Eva, really one of the more moving stories in the whole book, and it really lands the idea. And before you tell it, I guess this is a good time to mention that it's kind of a ray of hope for the people that are listening that don't consider themselves overly charismatic or don't feel that they were gifted these incredible communication skills. Your program, your book, and your company gives a lot of hope because it's a design and it's a brain thing.
Yeah. Yes, I think Eva does serve that purpose in many ways. So her story, as you know, is she is an 84-year-old lady. She's about 4 foot and not much. She's kind of heavy set. She has a thick Transylvanian accent. She was born and raised in the border of Romania and Hungary, so she's basically sounds like Dracula. And she comes out to speak, to a very tough audience, usually high school students, and she'll speak for 2 to 3 hours. And she'll be seated, because she's old, obviously, she'll be seated pretty much immobile, no eye contact, no body language. Everything we think we've got to get right, and that CEO was getting right, she's not doing. And yet, everything she teaches you, you're going to remember for the rest of your life. And how do we square that circle? Why is she effective getting everything wrong? Well, she's the perfect counterpoint to the CEO. We explained why he was ineffective, even though he got, quote unquote, everything right. What she is doing is perfectly aligning with the brain, and she's doing it in the most amazing ways. When I first saw her, I literally almost fell off my chair. I would have been the only guy in the room who understood what I was seeing in one sense. I don't mean that in an arrogant sense. The sense in which I mean that is I'm looking for certain things which a normal audience wouldn't be looking for. She orients her entire talk about, now she was 14 years old when she was hauled off to Auschwitz. Her parents were murdered and her sister. She and Miriam, her sister, were only spared because they were twins, and Dr. Mengele had a special hell prepared for twins because he was going to do medical experiments on them until they died. Miraculously, they survived. Their story is incredible, and Eva is still out there speaking, and anyone listening to this, go see her speak. Go find where she's speaking and listen to her story because it's extraordinary. But what's so amazing about it is somehow, and you could even make an interesting argument that maybe she has not been contaminated by corporate PowerPoint speak. She found a way to figure out practically everything that I spent 15 years trying to figure out through observation and research. She builds this lecture. It's usually about 2 hours, actually, with an hour's Q&A. It's a 2-hour lecture. She builds it around, guess what? 3 big ideas. And everything she teaches leads to that idea or emanates from that idea. So I can tell you what they are if you want, but the first one, she tells a story about how in the morning she would get up and she'd go to the kind of latrine area of this disgusting barracks, and quite commonly, she says, and I've heard her deliver this story many times now, she would step over the dead, naked bodies of other children. Children would die in the night. None of these kids were given enough clothing, and it was just a sad reality that they had to reclaim their clothing and shoes, or they wouldn't have survived. So these kids would be stripped and then left in the latrine, and the guards would take them away, and then tragically they'd be incinerated the next day. And so she's telling the story, and I am, like everybody in the room, just struggling to make any sense of it. I'm just like, I don't even know how to process this. I've got daughters this age. How would I even think about this? And she says something, and by the way, it's very interesting because she said something which just grabbed my attention, because when you hear a speaker say this, you know that they're doing something incredible. She said, "Why am I telling you this?" Now, that might seem like such an innocuous phrase. Why am I telling you this, or why am I showing you this, means that the speaker understands that they have presented you some fact or piece of data or story or illustration, But what they need to do is export the underlying insight or idea. It's shockingly rare. It's one of the two great hallmarks of communicators, if you want to observe what they're doing and know if they're doing it right, is when they say, now, why am I telling you this? She's about to export the insight. And what she actually does is she says always, because you need to understand, in Auschwitz, dying was easy. Living took every ounce of strength I had. And that was the teaching point from which she develops her main first teaching point, which is whatever you're facing in life, never, ever, ever give up. And I'm looking at this and I'm like, she's not just telling random Auschwitz stories. What she's doing is teaching 3 vital life lessons. And she's using the story of Auschwitz as the vehicle for teaching ideas. I'm sitting there, I'm like, nobody does this. It's incredible. And yet here you are, a woman with no delivery skills, no natural talent. I've talked to her about this loads of times. She thinks this is hilarious. She knows this. She does not do any of the things that the CEO does, but she's shockingly effective. And as you know, the prologue of the book is these 2 stories. And I end by saying something like, okay, so what's going on here? A guy has been incredibly effective following the rules that we've come to believe. Has been incredibly ineffective and yet has followed the rules we come to believe are true. We have this woman who is ignoring all the rules that we've been told are important and yet is incredibly effective. What do we conclude from this? The rules have to be wrong. We have the wrong rules. So again, those stories very fortunately stand for several important ideas. The importance of delivery over design, the importance of aligning with the brain. She aligns with the brain specifically through the lens of delivering ideas. He misaligns with the brain specifically through having a lack of logical sequence and flow. But I also like what you saw there, that at the end of the day, there's that rather antiseptic lesson, which is our rules are wrong. There is a more heartwarming lesson in there, which is there's tremendous hope for anyone who wants to be a great communicator, because everybody listening to this has the delivery skills equal to or superior to Eva Kor. And it's all about the architecture that flows out of it. So it's kind of fun that I started the book that way, because I think it sets up the rest of the book rather nicely.
No doubt, Tim. It's extremely powerful, and it would be a strong close, except I want to make sure that our listeners don't go away and say, well, no one can top Eva's story. That's one of the most tragic stories of humankind, and that would miss the mark a little bit. So in closing, I wonder if you can kind of urge my listeners to seek for something that you just touch on in the book, and it's becoming more and more prominent, which is retellability. You mentioned it earlier. Yeah. And I wonder how we can land a final idea with understanding that we want our message to be delivered, and then we want people to kind of chorus it out in a refrain as we go on.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. You said something really interesting there that, you can't top Eva. It's very tempting to look at the Eva Kor story and say, Tim, but she is compelling because this is the Holocaust, for heaven's sake. I mean, she walks in as a 13-year-old girl and walks out alive. Of course, inherently, it is more interesting, perhaps, than that CEO's presentation. But I've got to tell you a funny story, and I'll try and do her Transylvanian accent. I've traveled with Eva. I went to Auschwitz with Eva, which just the most wonderful but most disturbing and ungluing few days of my life, but something I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. But I got to know Eva really well. And I asked her once, actually I asked her on camera, we'll put this on the website at some point. I said, Eva, people love your lectures. Is it because it's the Holocaust? Is it just because it's Auschwitz? And she goes, no, Tim, most presenters on the Holocaust suck. This is her language. She goes, they get up. It's amazing, right? Listen to her. Listen to how brilliant she is. She goes, they get up there with their PowerPoints and all their pictures. She says, almost always I have to rescue the conference. I can't believe it. I mean, seriously, if Eva took the time to write my book, I didn't need to write it. She got it. She says it's not about Auschwitz. It's about how you tell the story. And it's funny because I do have to answer that question, which is isn't she better because it's Auschwitz? And it's like, no, she'll tell you that most Holocaust survivors suck. Now, I wouldn't use that language, but she's allowed to. Anyway, to your final point, yes. I mean, we've touched on. I love the way we've done this today, actually, Joe. We've touched on some of the biggest ideas and themes in the book, and retailability is perhaps what it stands for. Is what is the ultimate standard you're shooting for? And retailability is very simple. In most communication settings, we did mention this a little bit earlier. Persuading the person you're talking to, moving them to action, is absolutely important. But so much of the time, it's what they then do with the message is what really matters. Now, the place you see this most simply is perhaps in sales. You know, you have a conversation with somebody at the customer. You might meet with 2 or 3 people, but the decision-making group is a lot more people than that, maybe 7, 8, 10 people, and the decision isn't going to be made in that first meeting. It's going to be made in a subsequent meeting. And so the standard we have to hit in communication is not that it's crisp and compelling in the first meeting. It's that the guy or girl you've met with can retell the story effectively in that subsequent meeting. That's a much, much higher standard. And this is what all communication's about, right? If I'm, as I said, talking to a big group of people about some big societal change or the problem of world hunger, I'm trying to rally them and let them become ambassadors for what we do, or to spread a message throughout a company, or to spread a message to all the interested parties. And I don't think retellability is the word that even gets mentioned in 99, if not 100% of communications books, but it's the ultimate goal. So that's what we should be shooting for. And what that does is it drives you to levels of crispness and simplicity and organization and focus on ideas, because that's the only way you get a message to be retellable. The other thing it drives you to is a totally different way of equipping the people you've met with. That's the main reason I don't use PowerPoint, because, what did I say? People don't represent someone else's PowerPoint deck. People will represent a very crisp document which only focuses on the big ideas and the key supporting data. And the proof of that is the hundreds of millions of dollars that our clients have seen come in through sales that have happened where they know retellability has happened. So if anything, I mean, the summary of this whole call is that the underlying key to everything is the human brain. If you understand the way the brain works, you can communicate well. The second big idea, perhaps, is that of all the things you need to understand about the brain, it's that it traffics in the level of with ideas, that ideas are the currency of the brain. And you have to focus on, pivot, and orient around the ideas that will lead your customer to action. And then the final idea, tying it all together, is the way you know you've succeeded and the standard to which you must aspire is not just that you were crisp and compelling in the moment with that individual you met with, but that your message was ultimately retellable. So curiously, that kind of ties the entire hour together in rather an unplanned but convenient way.
Yeah, there's no doubt, Tim. You know, I would say that I'm in awe of what we just heard, but the way that you approach disseminating the information, it makes it feel very attainable. And, you know, when I pair this book with the generosity and expertise that you brought to the podcast today, it becomes one of my favorite experiences, one of my favorite reads that I've ever come across. I just want to say that.
That's so kind. That is incredibly kind. And you know what? What you just said is really important. This isn't that hard. This isn't that hard. There's a phrase we use in every meeting with every client, and we warn them. We say, listen, what we're teaching you is not difficult intellectually. It's difficult culturally. What I mean by that is you can do everything we teach in the book. The place it's hard is when you decide to stand up and you're willing to do it with no PowerPoint deck. It's usually cultural barriers. But then once you've done it once, you never look back. You're like, oh, man, I'm loving it. And trust me, there's no audience out there waiting for their next deck. So if people are listening to this and they're saying, you know what, I like this, I'd like to explore it, that would be a great closing thought. This isn't hard. This isn't hard intellectually. Nothing I've described to you is out of your reach. It may be culturally hard when you stand up and do it a different way, and it's not what people are expecting. But trust me, that's only hard the first time, because when you walk off stage and people are just adoring of what you've done, then that's the reinforcement you need to continue down that path.
Yeah, Tim, without being self-serving, today in New York City, I finished my second straight presentation with no slides, felt half naked both times, and the feedback on both were off the charts. And I used so many of the skills from the book. It's not a commercial, but it is in a way, because I'm going to be presenting next week, and you better believe I'm going back to the book So I thank you from my standpoint.
I love it.
But I mean, this is a full-on endorsement because people listening right now need to know about this, and you've been incredibly generous with your time, and I just want to thank you for that.
Not at all. I am so delighted that's working for you. It's a nice Kool-Aid to drink because it's an easier process. It's more fun for you as a speaker. It's way more fun for the audience. So I'm ecstatic that you're on this journey. I hope you can fill me in on how that journey continues for you. So thank you. And you know what? It's not generous. I love talking about this stuff. When what you do is also your passion, it's great. So it's just been a delight to kick this around with you. This has been fascinating. Thank you.
He's Tim Pollard, the compelling communicator, mastering the art and science of exceptional presentation design. Don't forget the word design. You can find everything Tim's up to at aradium.com. And Tim doesn't know it yet, but off air, I will be peppering him with further questions. Timmy, thank you so much for joining us today on 1% Better.